My manager spent 4 years taking credit for my work. Then he gave my dream role to someone else. I resigned that afternoon. 8 months later, he called asking for help. I am a 36-year-old male. I worked at the same company for 11 years. And this is the story of how my manager took everything I built, handed it to someone else, and how the whole thing collapsed in a way I could not have planned if I had tried. So I joined the company fresh out of college at 25, and I was genuinely passionate about the work. It was a mid-sized logistics firm, and I was in the operations department. And within the first 2 years, I had redesigned 2 of our core tracking processes in a way that saved the company somewhere around $400,000 annually. And my manager at the time, a man named Greg, told me in my review that I had one of the sharpest operational minds he had seen at my level, and that he was going to make sure. The right people noticed, and I believed him because I had no reason not to. Greg got promoted about a year later, and I got a new manager named Victor. And Victor and I were never going to be close. I understood that quickly. He was the kind of person who managed through control rather than trust, and he liked being the smartest person in every room he walked into. And I was apparently a problem for that dynamic, because within about 3 months of him taking over our team, he had started running my ideas through himself before presenting them upward. And every time I flagged something to him directly, it would surface 2 weeks later in a leadership meeting as his initiative. I raised it with him once, directly and professionally, and he smiled and told me that's how teams work, and that individual credit wasn't the point, and that what mattered was outcomes. And I sat with that for a while, because it sounded reasonable on the surface, and I was young enough to half believe it, but the feeling never went away. Over the next few years, I kept building things. I developed a vendor management system that became standard across 3 departments. I led the rollout of a new routing software that reduced delivery errors by 31%. I trained 2 junior analysts who both went on to get promoted ahead of schedule. And through all of it, Victor's name was the one attached to the work at the leadership level, and mine was not. And every performance review I had with him was fine on paper, but somehow never translated into the kind of advancement that the work should have produced. I want to tell you that I was completely passive through all of this, because I had conversations with Victor. I flagged the pattern to HR once in a way that was professional and documented, and HR had a conversation with Victor that resulted in absolutely nothing changing except Victor becoming more careful about how he did what he did. And I stayed because I had built something real there, and I kept telling myself it would eventually be undeniable, and eventually someone above Victor would see it clearly. Then the company announced a new division, a supply chain innovation unit that was essentially going to do at scale exactly what I had been doing quietly for years. And I applied for the director role because I was the most qualified person in the building for it. And I knew it, and I think most people who had worked with me knew it too. And I got called into Victor's office 2 weeks after I submitted my application, and he told me he had reviewed my file, and that while I was a strong contributor, he didn't feel I was ready for a director-level position, and that he would not be supporting my candidacy. I asked him who he was supporting, and he told me he had recommended a man named Chris who had joined the company 14 months earlier from outside the industry. I want to tell you who Chris was before I tell you what happened next, because it matters, and I am not saying this bitterly. I am saying it as a factual account. Chris was a perfectly pleasant person who had a good resume from a different sector, and who had spent his 14 months at the company working closely with Victor on a project that I had originally scoped and handed off. And he was smart enough, but he had no deep operational knowledge of our systems, no relationships with the vendors, no understanding of the specific infrastructure I had spent a decade building, and he was given the director role, and I was told to report to him. I handed in my resignation the same afternoon. Victor looked genuinely surprised, which surprised me, and he asked if I wanted to take a few days to think about it. And I told him I'd been thinking about it for about 4 years and that I felt clear, and I worked my notice period professionally. I documented everything thoroughly. I handed over my systems in good order, and on my last day, I said goodbye to the people I liked, and I left. I took 3 weeks off, and then I started consulting independently, specifically in logistics operations. And within 2 months, I had 3 clients, small to mid-sized companies who needed exactly the kind of work I had been doing for free for Victor's career for the better part of a decade. And by the end of the first year, I was billing more than my old salary and working for people who knew whose work they were paying for. I want to be clear that what happened next was not something I had any involvement in. I had moved on genuinely and completely. I was not watching the company or tracking what was happening there, and I found out through a former colleague who texted me about 8 months after I left. The new division under Chris had been struggling almost from launch, and my former colleague explained that the vendor relationships I had built over years had not transferred because vendors work with people, not companies, and several key partners had quietly reduced their engagement when I left. And the routing systems I had built required a specific institutional knowledge to maintain and adapt that Chris did not have and had not been able to develop quickly enough, and the 31% error reduction I had achieved had not only failed to improve under the new structure, it had reversed, and the error rate was now higher than it had been before I had ever touched it. 7 months after the division launched, it was restructured, and about 3 months after that, Victor was moved laterally into a role that my colleague described as a title with no actual authority, and Chris was quietly moved back into a mid-level position in a different department. My colleague asked me if I felt vindicated, and I thought about it honestly for a moment, and I told him I felt nothing particular about Victor and Chris. What I felt was grateful that I had left when I did, and that I had spent the past year building something that was entirely mine, where my name was on every single thing I produced. About a year after all of this, the company reached out to me through a senior director I had always respected, asking if I would be open to a consulting engagement to help stabilize the division, and I quoted them a day rate that reflected exactly what 11 years of institutional knowledge and operational expertise is actually worth. And they agreed without negotiating. And I did the work on my terms and delivered what they needed and invoiced them and moved on. I never spoke to Victor again, and I have no particular feeling about that either way. I think about that conversation where he told me individual credit wasn't the point and that what mattered was outcomes. And I think about the outcome of my first year consulting, the outcome of the division he built without me, and I think about my name on every invoice I have ever sent, and I think he was right that outcomes are what matter, just not in the way he meant it.